Picture the most fearsome warrior imaginable. Goliath was not just a soldier, he was a walking fortress. Layers of bronze armor, a spear designed to kill from a distance, and a voice so thunderous it paralyzed an entire army. By every human measure, he was unbeatable. And yet, the one who stepped forward to face him wasn't a seasoned warrior or a champion of Israel. It was a teenage shepherd, no armor, no sword, no reputation. So how could such a battle even be possible? And more importantly, how could the outcome have nothing to do with strength, size, or weapons at all? This is the story of an army that froze, a king who hesitated, and a shepherd no one noticed. Fighting for a victory everyone else believed was already lost. 3,000 years ago, two massive armies stood paralyzed on opposite ridges, locked in a standoff that threatened to erase a nation before it truly began. On the northern hills were the Israelites, led by their first king Saul. On the southern hills stood the Philistines, a technologically superior force wielding iron weapons that the bronze-equipped Israelites could not match. Between them lay the Valley of Elah, a narrow, sun-scorched corridor that served as the primary gateway from the coastal plains into the heart of the Judean mountains. This valley wasn't just a piece of geography. It was a tactical bottleneck where the future of the Israelite people balanced on the edge of a blade. If the Philistines broke through this pass, they would have a clear path to the major Israelite cities, effectively cutting Saul's young kingdom in half and ending the dream of a unified Israel forever. The reason no one moved was purely practical. Between the two hills sat a steep ravine with a dry stream bed at the bottom. To attack, one army would have to scramble down their own slope, cross the narrow floor, and then attempt to climb up the other side while being picked off by arrows and spears from above. It was a tactical suicide mission. So the soldiers waited in the heat and the dust, watching each other for weeks as the tension reached a breaking point. But this wasn't just a military delay. It was a deliberate daily ritual of psychological execution. What the Israelites didn't realize was that the Philistines weren't waiting for a battle of numbers. They were waiting for the Israelite spirit to break entirely. Every morning and every evening, a massive figure stepped out from the Philistine line and walked down into the center of the valley. His voice was so loud it didn't just carry across the distance, it seemed to vibrate in the chests of the Israelite soldiers on the opposite ridge. This was Goliath of Gath. He was a champion in the literal, ancient sense, a man chosen to represent his entire army in single combat. His proposal to Saul was a legal and military contract. Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects, but if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. This was an ancient custom designed to prevent the total slaughter of two armies. One fight, one winner, one total outcome for both nations. But there was a problem that Saul could not solve. To accept the challenge, he needed a man who believed he could actually survive the encounter. And as the sun rose on the 40th day of this standoff, it became clear that no such man existed in the entire Israelite camp. The psychological toll was devastating. The soldiers weren't just afraid of dying, they were losing their faith in the very idea of their nation and their God. The real bombshell was that while the Israelites remained frozen in fear, their enemy was already considering the war won without having to fire a single arrow. The silence from Saul's royal tent was becoming as deafening as Goliath's shouting. The king of Israel, who was taller and stronger than any of his subjects, sat in the shadows of his pavilion, weighing the cost of his own cowardice. The nation was about to fold, and the promise of a unified kingdom was on the verge of vanishing into history. But while the leadership in the camp was paralyzed, a teenage boy who wasn't even a soldier was just beginning his journey toward the valley, carrying nothing but bread, cheese, and a total lack of fear. To understand why the Israelite army was paralyzed, you have to understand the physical reality of Goliath. He wasn't just a tall man, he was a walking fortress. Historical estimates and biblical descriptions place him at nearly 9 feet tall, but his height was only half of the threat. He wore a coat of scale armor made of bronze that weighed roughly 125 pounds. To put that in perspective, that is heavier than many of the teenage soldiers standing in Saul's lines. He wore bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze helmet, leaving almost no vulnerable surface area for a standard spear or sword to penetrate. The weapons he carried were designed for total physical dominance. He wielded a bronze javelin and a massive sword, but his primary weapon was a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam. The iron head of that spear alone weighed 15 pounds. In an era where most combat was decided by the reach of your weapon and the strength of your thrust, Goliath possessed a reach that no ordinary human could match. He didn't just look unbeatable. Mathematically and tactically, he was. Every time he stepped into the valley, he was a living reminder that the Israelites were outmatched in technology, size, and sheer physical power. This wasn't just a physical confrontation, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. For 40 days, Goliath performed the same ritual. He would walk out at dawn and dusk, the two times of day when the light is most deceptive and the human mind is most prone to anxiety, and hurl insults not just at the soldiers, but at their God. By doing this repeatedly, he turned the Israelite camp into a pressure cooker of shame. The soldiers began to believe the Philistine narrative, that their God had abandoned them and that their king was a fraud. The strategy was working perfectly. Each day Goliath shouted, the Israelite lines didn't just hold their ground, they actually retreated. Men who had been trained for war were now hiding in trenches. The humiliation was so complete that the soldiers stopped talking about how to win and started talking about how to survive the inevitable slaughter. They were no longer an army. They were a group of terrified individuals waiting for the end. But the most shocking part of this stalemate wasn't Goliath's size. It was the fact that the Philistines were using him as a distraction. While the Israelites were hyper-focused on the giant in the valley, they failed to see that they were being systematically dismantled from the inside out by their own terror. Their morale was gone. Their supplies were running low, and the internal unity of the tribes was fracturing. The Philistines didn't need to charge the hill. They were simply watching the Israelite kingdom collapse under its own weight. Saul was desperate. He began offering massive incentives to anyone who would face the giant, great wealth, his own daughter in marriage, and a permanent tax exemption for the victor's entire family. It was a king's ransom, an offer that should have tempted any ambitious young warrior. Yet despite the promise of becoming the richest and most powerful commoner in the land, the silence in the camp remained absolute. No amount of money could convince a man to sign his own death warrant. The situation had reached a total dead end, and the Philistines knew it. King Saul was the tallest man in Israel, literally standing head and shoulders above his subjects. By every ancient standard of kingship, the responsibility to fight Goliath belonged to him alone. In the ancient world, a king's primary job was to lead from the front, serving as the ultimate protector of the people. If a champion appeared from the enemy side, it was the king who was expected to step into the gap. But Saul was paralyzed. He wasn't just afraid of Goliath's spear. He was haunted by the knowledge that he had already lost the spiritual mandate to lead. This leadership vacuum created a toxic atmosphere throughout the camp. When the man at the top trembles, the men in the ranks lose their footing. The Israelite camp, which should have been a place of preparation and discipline, had devolved into a site of whispered dread. Soldiers huddled around small fires, not discussing tactics, but sharing rumors about the giant's strength. The shame was palpable. These were men who had seen victories before, but the sheer scale of the Philistine threat had stripped them of their identity as a chosen people. They were now just a collection of frightened farmers and shepherds trapped on a hillside. Saul's attempt to buy a hero with riches and marriage shifted the focus from national duty to personal greed, and it failed spectacularly. By offering a reward, he admitted that he was too afraid to do the job himself. This move signaled to every soldier that the situation was truly hopeless. If the king was willing to give away his daughter and his treasury just to avoid the valley floor, the giant must truly be a god of war. The morale of the army didn't just dip, it vanished. Men began to slip away into the night, deserting a cause they believed was already lost. The physical reality of the camp was one of stagnation and decay. For 40 days, they had consumed their rations without making a single move. In the ancient world, maintaining an army in the field for that long without action was a logistical nightmare. Resources were drying up, and the heat of the valley was taking its toll. Every morning, when Goliath's voice boomed across the ravine, the Israelite soldiers felt a little smaller and a little more abandoned. They were waiting for a miracle, but they were doing so with the posture of men who expected a massacre. The most dangerous part of this failure was that Saul's hesitation was effectively handing the keys of the kingdom to the Philistines. By refusing to fight, Saul wasn't just saving his own life. He was confirming the Philistine claim that the God of Israel was powerless. The geopolitical stakes were absolute. If no one stood up, the nation of Israel would be erased from the map before it even truly began. The entire experiment of the monarchy was failing in real time. But while Saul sat in his tent weighing his options, the why of the entire conflict was about to be reframed. Up until this point, the war had been viewed through the lens of military hardware and physical stature. No one in the camp was looking at the situation through the lens of faith or historical covenant. They saw a giant. They didn't see a target. That changed the moment a young boy arrived from Bethlehem with a delivery of grain and a perspective that no one in the professional army possessed. David was never meant to be at the front lines. He was the youngest of 8 brothers, left behind in Bethlehem to tend his father Jesse's sheep, while the 3 eldest, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, served in Saul's army. His presence in the Valley of Elah was purely logistical. Jesse, concerned for his son's well-being after 40 days of stalemate, sent David with a specific ration, an ephah of roasted grain, 10 loaves of bread for his brothers, and 10 cheeses for their commanding officer. This wasn't a military deployment, it was a delivery run. David arrived at the camp's perimeter just as the Israelite army was drawing up in battle formation, shouting their war cry. To an outsider, it looked like the battle was finally beginning. To the soldiers inside, it was a hollow ritual they performed every morning before retreating back to their trenches. David left his supplies with the baggage keeper and ran to the battle lines to greet his brothers. As he was speaking with them, the familiar shadow of Goliath emerged from the Philistine ranks. David watched as the giant took his position and repeated his defiance. But while the seasoned soldiers around him cringed and fled at the mere sight of the champion, David reacted with a confusion that bordered on fury. He didn't see a monster. He saw a breach of contract. For David, the physical size of the man was irrelevant compared to the theological insult he was hurling. He began asking the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this reproach from Israel?" The soldiers repeated the king's promise of wealth and royalty, but David's focus remained on the uncircumcised Philistine, who was defying the armies of the living God. This wasn't a young man looking for a payout. It was a believer looking at a spiritual contradiction. How could a nation backed by the creator of the universe be bullied by a single man in bronze scales? David's line of questioning was a direct challenge to the status quo of the camp. He was essentially calling out the entire army for their lack of faith, and his voice began to carry. The bombshell was that the first person to offer a solution to the national crisis wasn't a general or a veteran. It was a delivery boy who wasn't even authorized to be on the battlefield. David's persistence started a chain reaction of whispers. In a camp starved for hope, news of a defiant voice traveled fast. Most men were dismissive, but others were desperate enough to listen. David wasn't speaking in metaphors. He was treating the giant like a practical problem that had a spiritual solution. He saw the fear in the eyes of the men around him and realized that the unbeatable nature of Goliath was entirely a matter of perspective. While the soldiers were measuring Goliath against themselves, David was measuring Goliath against God. This shift in narrative was dangerous. In a military environment, dissent and radical confidence can be seen as a threat to the chain of command. David was disrupting the comfortable, shared misery of the Israelite army, and his presence was about to cause a confrontation within his own family before he ever reached the king. But what David didn't know was that his own brother was watching him with a growing resentment that was about to boil over in front of the entire company. The battle for the valley was about to start, but the first person David had to fight wasn't the giant. It was the man who had known him his entire life. Eliab, David's eldest brother, had been standing nearby when David began questioning the soldiers. As a career soldier who had spent 40 days in the trenches of humiliation, Eliab's reaction to his younger brother wasn't pride, but a burning, defensive anger. He didn't just want David to be quiet. He wanted to crush the boy's spirit before it could highlight his own cowardice. Eliab stepped forward and confronted David in front of the other men, demanding to know why he had left the few sheep he was supposed to be tending in the wilderness. He accused David of being conceited and having a wicked heart, claiming the boy had only come down to the valley to treat the war like a spectator sport. This was a calculated attempt at public shaming. In ancient Israelite culture, the eldest brother held significant authority, and by painting David as an irresponsible, thrill-seeking child, Eliab was attempting to invalidate everything David had said. He was trying to protect the professional dignity of the army by silencing the one person who pointed out that the experts were failing. If David was just a brat looking for trouble, then the soldiers didn't have to feel guilty about their own fear. But the contradiction that Eliab couldn't overcome was that David's outrage wasn't rooted in youthful arrogance, but in a logical understanding of their national covenant. David didn't retaliate with insults. Instead, he offered a calm, devastating rebuttal. "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" With those words, David reframed the entire conflict. He wasn't there for the glory or the bread. He was there because the honor of their nation was being liquidated in broad daylight. He turned away from his brother, a symbolic break from family and social expectations, and continued to speak to other soldiers, repeating his questions about the giant. He was looking for anyone who still had a spark of defiance left. The word of this strange, fearless youth began to ripple through the camp like a shockwave. In an environment defined by total silence and defeatism, David's voice was the only thing moving against the grain. Eventually, the reports reached the royal pavilion. Saul's scouts told the king that there was a young man speaking words of confidence that were actually starting to stick. Saul, who was desperate for any alternative to a total Philistine breakthrough, ordered the boy to be brought to him immediately. The bombshell was that the king of Israel was now so depleted of options that he was willing to entertain a conversation with a teenager who wasn't even authorized to be on the battlefield. David was ushered into the presence of the king, standing in the same tent where the greatest military minds of the nation had spent weeks failing to find a solution. The contrast was stark. Saul, the tall, weary, and compromised ruler, and David, the ruddy, dusty shepherd who hadn't yet been broken by the reality of the battlefield. David didn't bow or stammer. He looked at the king and said, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." It was the first time in over a month that anyone had spoken about the giant in the future tense of victory. But what David didn't realize was that by stepping into that tent, he was entering a different kind of trap, one where the king's own insecurity would try to mold David into a miniature version of the very failure he was trying to fix. Saul was about to offer David the very things that had already failed the rest of the army, setting up a clash of strategies that would determine how the battle would actually be fought. Saul looked at the boy and stated the obvious. David was a youth, and Goliath had been a professional man of war since his own youth. This wasn't just a critique of David's age, it was a military assessment of physics and experience. In Saul's mind, a battle was won by the man with the better reach and the thicker shield. David, however, countered with a resume that had nothing to do with human warfare. He explained that as a shepherd, he had faced lions and bears that attempted to steal his father's sheep. He hadn't used a sword. He had tracked them down, struck them, and when they turned on him, he killed them with his bare hands. To David, Goliath wasn't a legendary champion. He was just another predator threatening the flock of Israel. This logic was the first time Saul had heard a practical plan based on past performance rather than current fear. David's why was simple. The same God who delivered him from the paw of the lion would deliver him from the hand of the Philistine. Saul, seeing no other volunteers and perhaps hoping for a miracle to save his throne, finally relented. He told David to go, but he insisted on one condition. David had to go as a soldier. Saul took his own royal armor, the best bronze protection in the kingdom, and placed it on the boy. He strapped his own sword to David's side and set a bronze helmet on his head. The scene was almost a parody of the current state of Israel. David tried to walk, but he couldn't. He was a mobile, agile shepherd, suddenly encased in the heavy, clanking failure of Saul's military philosophy. The armor was designed for a man head and shoulders taller than everyone else. On David, it was a bronze cage. He realized that if he fought Goliath on Goliath's terms, using the giant's own style of heavy infantry combat, he was guaranteed to die. He stripped the armor off and laid it on the floor of the tent. By rejecting the king's protection, he was rejecting the standard rules of engagement. David walked out of the tent carrying only 3 things: his staff, his sling, and a shepherd's bag. He didn't go to the armory for weapons. He went to the natural environment. He descended into the dry stream bed at the bottom of the valley, the neutral ground between the 2 armies. There, he carefully selected 5 smooth stones from the brook. He chose smooth stones because they were aerodynamically stable, capable of flying with the accuracy of a modern bullet when launched from a leather sling. He wasn't choosing them for their weight, but for their precision. The Israelite army watched from the ridge in stunned silence as the boy emerged from the ravine and began walking toward the Philistine line. They expected a massacre. They saw a boy with a stick walking toward a giant, with a spear the size of a tree. They didn't see a warrior. They saw a sacrifice. The bombshell was that David wasn't planning a duel. He was planning an assassination. He knew that Goliath's heavy armor made him slow and that his helmet had a single, fatal opening at the forehead. While the entire world was looking at the giant's strength, David was the only person in the valley looking for a weakness. Goliath began to move forward, preceded by his shield-bearer. When he finally got close enough to see his opponent clearly, he was insulted. He saw a ruddy and handsome youth with a staff, not a champion in armor. He famously shouted, "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" He cursed David by the Philistine gods and promised to feed his flesh to the birds and the wild animals. It was the standard intimidation tactic of the ancient world, designed to make an opponent's heart fail before the first blow. But David didn't flinch. He did something no one in the valley expected. He started to run. David didn't run away. He ran directly toward the giant. In the ancient world, a slinger was a specialized type of light infantry, essentially the sniper of the Bronze Age. By running, David was closing the distance to find his optimal range while staying mobile enough to avoid Goliath's massive throwing spear. As he sprinted, David shouted back a correction to Goliath's worldview. He told the giant that while Goliath came with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, David came in the name of the Lord of Hosts. He predicted exactly what was about to happen. He would strike the giant down and behead him, not to show his own strength, but so the whole world would know that there was a God in Israel. The sheer speed of the encounter caught everyone off guard. Goliath was a heavy infantry specialist, built for a stationary, grinding fight where he could use his massive reach to impale anyone who got close. He was likely moving slowly, weighed down by his 125 pounds of armor, expecting a traditional hand-to-hand engagement. He didn't realize that David was playing an entirely different game. As David ran, he reached into his shepherd's bag, pulled out one of the smooth stones, and fitted it into the leather pouch of his sling. He began to whirl it above his head, the sound of the leather whistling through the air becoming the only noise in the sudden silence of the valley. The physics of a sling are devastating. A skilled slinger could launch a stone at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour with the stopping power of a .45 caliber handgun. David wasn't just throwing a rock, he was firing a projectile. At the precise moment of his stride, David released one of the cords. The stone didn't just hit Goliath, it sank into his forehead. The giant's bronze helmet was designed to deflect downward sword strokes and horizontal spear thrusts, but it left a small gap at the brow for vision. David's stone found that exact square inch of vulnerability. The impact was instantaneous. Goliath's knees buckled, and the unbeatable champion of the Philistines crashed face first onto the dirt. The sound of his heavy armor hitting the ground echoed up both ridges, followed by a silence so absolute it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The Philistine army stood frozen, their entire military strategy having just collapsed in a single second. Their god-king was down, and the boy who had done it didn't even have a sword in his hand. The bombshell was that the greatest military threat in the region had been neutralized by a weapon usually used to keep sheep away from bushes. David didn't wait for the giant to recover. He ran to the fallen body and stood over the massive fall. Because David had come to the fight without a blade, he reached down and drew Goliath's own sword from its sheath. It was a weapon so heavy and large that David likely had to use both hands to wield it. In a final, brutal act of symbolic victory, he used the giant's own steel to behead him. He held the head of the champion up for both armies to see, providing the visual proof that the invincible power of Gath was a lie. The psychological vacuum that had held the Israelites on the ridge for 40 days suddenly shattered. The sight of their champion dead didn't just discourage the Philistines, it broke their legal contract of winner takes all. They didn't surrender as Goliath had promised. They turned and ran for their lives toward the gates of Gath and Ekron. What followed wasn't just a retreat, it was a slaughter. The Israelite soldiers, fueled by 40 days of pent-up shame and a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, poured down the hillside like a flood, realizing for the first time that the enemy was just as human and just as mortal as they were. The valley floor was no longer a stage for a duel. It was the site of a total rout. The Israelites, led by the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, chased the Philistines all the way to the gates of their own fortified cities, Gath and Ekron. The road was littered with the bodies of the fleeing enemy and the discarded armor they threw away to run faster. For Israel, this wasn't just a tactical win, it was a psychological resurrection. They went from a paralyzed mob to a conquering force in the span of a single afternoon. When the soldiers finally returned from the pursuit, they plundered the Philistine camp, reclaiming the resources and wealth that had been used to fuel their 40-day humiliation. In the center of the chaos, David remained a figure of quiet, almost unsettling focus. He didn't join the initial chase. Instead, he eventually made his way back toward the royal lines, carrying the head of the giant in one hand and Goliath's massive sword in the other. This sword was more than a trophy. It was a physical manifestation of a shift in the world's power structure. The bombshell was that the moment David stepped back toward the king's presence, the political landscape of Israel changed forever. Saul, who had watched the entire event from the ridge, was suddenly struck by a realization that had nothing to do with the Philistines. He turned to his general, Abner, and asked, "Whose son is this youth?" It was a haunting question. Saul had met David earlier that day, but seeing him now, covered in the blood of the giant and holding the sword of the champion, the king saw a threat to his own dynasty. David was no longer just a shepherd or a musician who played the harp to soothe Saul's dark moods. He was now a national hero whose name would soon be sung in the streets above the king's own. When David finally stood before Saul to confirm his identity as the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, the relationship between the two men was already beginning to sour. The victory had saved the kingdom, but it had doomed the king's peace of mind. David eventually took the giant's weapons and placed them in his own tent, but the head of Goliath was taken toward Jerusalem, a city that was, at that time, still held by the Jebusites. This was a prophetic move. By bringing the trophy to that specific location, David was signaling a future where he would not just be a soldier, but the king who would finally capture that city and make it the capital of a unified nation. The boy who had arrived with cheese and bread was leaving the valley as the primary figure of Israelite history. The victory in the valley was more than a military triumph. It was a physical restoration of a spiritual truth. For 40 days, the people of Israel had forgotten who they were, but through the hands of a shepherd, they were reminded that no giant is bigger than the promise of the Creator. David didn't win because he was the strongest or the most experienced. He won because he was the only man present who refused to let his fear of the world outweigh his faith in God. As the sun set over the Valley of Elah, the shame that had hung over the camp was gone. replaced by the realization that when a person stands for what is right, they never stand alone. It was the day a shepherd became a king, and the day a nation rediscovered its soul.